The soldier had survived the cannon fire, the freezing rain, and the endless Russian bombardment, only to die slowly in a mud-filled tent less than 2 miles from the front line, wrapped in a blanket stiff with ice, while rats moved through the darkness around him. That was the Crimean War. Not the polished version painted in old history books, not the romantic paintings of cavalry charges beneath fluttering flags, not the neat stories about honor, empire, and glory. The real war was colder, dirtier, and far more terrifying than most people were ever meant to see. When most Americans think about 19th century warfare, they imagine colorful uniforms, marching bands, officers on horseback, and battles fought with some kind of old-world dignity. But Crimea shattered that illusion. Beneath the surface of those famous paintings was a conflict that looked disturbingly modern. Endless artillery fire thundered across frozen hills. Entire camps collapsed under disease. Supply systems failed so badly that soldiers froze to death waiting for winter coats, sitting untouched aboard ships anchored just offshore. Men marched through knee-deep mud, carrying rifles that had become deadlier than commanders truly understood. And for the first time in modern history, civilians back home could read about the horror almost as it happened. War was no longer distant. It was entering people's homes through newspapers, sketches, and first-hand reports that exposed suffering on a scale Europe struggled to comprehend. But even those reports only captured part of the nightmare, because what happened in Crimea was not simply a military disaster. It was the moment the old world collided headfirst with modern industrial killing. The generals still thought like Napoleon. The technology no longer did, and that gap turned the Crimean Peninsula into a graveyard. Across the rocky coastline and frozen valleys near Sevastopol, soldiers from Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia found themselves trapped inside a war none of them were prepared for. The weather alone became an enemy. Blizzards swept through camps built without proper shelter. Horses collapsed in the snow. Food spoiled before reaching the front. Medical care barely existed by modern standards. Some soldiers entered field hospitals with survivable wounds and never walked out again. Others simply disappeared into storms, disease outbreaks, or the chaos of endless bombardments that shook the earth day and night. And yet, despite all of this, the Crimean War is often remembered as a side note between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, almost as if history itself tried to look away from what really happened there. But the deeper you go into this war, the darker it becomes. Because Crimea was not just another 19th century conflict, it was the first warning of the industrial nightmare waiting for the world in the 20th century. And before this story is over, you'll see why some historians quietly believe the road to the trenches of World War I may have truly begun in the frozen mud of Crimea. For decades, people remembered this conflict through carefully selected images. Noble officers sitting tall on horseback, cavalry charges painted like scenes from an adventure novel, flags waving through cannon smoke while commanders spoke of courage, duty, and empire. Even school books often reduced the war to a handful of dramatic moments, as if the entire campaign had been one long parade interrupted by a few famous battles. But the men who actually stood in the mud of Crimea would barely have recognized that version of events, because behind the polished stories was a war defined by exhaustion, confusion, and systems breaking apart faster than armies could adapt. Most European commanders entered the conflict believing they still understood warfare. Many had grown up studying Napoleon, convinced that discipline, formation, and aggressive attacks could still dominate the battlefield. Yet the weapons waiting in Crimea had changed the rules completely. Rifled muskets now allowed ordinary infantrymen to fire accurately at distances older commanders considered impossible. Artillery had become heavier, deadlier, and more precise. Steamships carried armies across the Black Sea faster than previous generations could imagine. Railroads moved supplies and reinforcements with industrial efficiency. Even photography had entered the battlefield, allowing civilians back home to witness real soldiers staring blankly into the camera with hollow eyes and worn faces. The world was modernizing faster than the generals leading the war, and nobody truly understood the consequences yet. That disconnect turned every mistake into catastrophe. Soldiers marched in dense formations that made perfect targets for modern rifles. Officers issued commands from horseback as artillery shells tore through organized lines that would have survived easily in earlier wars. Entire assaults collapsed not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because military thinking itself had fallen behind technology. One British officer later admitted that many commanders still imagined battlefields the way they had looked 50 years earlier. But Crimea was no longer the age of elegant maneuver. It was becoming the age of industrial destruction. The conditions made everything worse. Winter storms swept through camps with terrifying force. Tents collapsed beneath snow and freezing rain. Supply animals died by the thousands, leaving food, ammunition, and medical supplies stranded in muddy roads that stretched for miles. At the port of Balaclava, warehouses overflowed with supplies, while soldiers near the front shivered without proper boots or coats because the transportation system had completely broken down. Men wrapped blankets around their feet and huddled beside weak fires that barely survived the wind coming off the Black Sea. Some soldiers later wrote that the cold frightened them more than Russian artillery. And still the war dragged on. The siege lines outside Sevastopol became endless scars carved into frozen ground. Cannon fire echoed day and night. Entire hills disappeared beneath smoke. Soldiers dug trenches, repaired defenses, carried wounded men through mud, and waited for attacks that could begin at any hour. Many no longer cared about politics, religion, or imperial rivalry. Survival became the only thing left that mattered. And perhaps the darkest truth of all was this: the suffering was not hidden from the public. For the first time in history, reporters sent detailed accounts back home almost immediately. Families in London and Paris opened newspapers during breakfast and read descriptions of freezing camps, overcrowded hospitals, and soldiers dying slowly far from home. The modern war machine had arrived, not only on the battlefield, but inside the minds of ordinary people watching from thousands of miles away. The deeper Europe marched into Crimea, the more obvious it became that nobody truly controlled what this war was turning into. On paper, the conflict had started over politics, religion, and the balance of power between empires. Russia wanted greater influence over the weakening Ottoman Empire and access to strategic waterways that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Britain feared Russian expansion would threaten trade routes to India. France wanted prestige and influence after years of instability at home. The Ottoman Empire struggled simply to survive as larger powers circled around it like predators sensing weakness. At first glance, it sounded like another typical 19th century power struggle. Kings, emperors, diplomats, and generals all believed they understood the rules. But once armies landed in Crimea, those old assumptions began collapsing almost immediately. The campaign was supposed to be decisive and controlled. Instead, it became slow, chaotic, and brutally expensive. Thousands of soldiers found themselves stranded on a narrow peninsula that seemed determined to destroy them before the enemy ever could. The geography alone became a nightmare. Dry hills turned into oceans of mud after rainstorms. Supply wagons sank axle-deep into roads that barely deserved to be called roads at all. Bitter winds coming off the Black Sea cut through thin uniforms and weak shelters. At night, soldiers listened to canvas tents snapping violently in the wind, while distant artillery echoed across the darkness like rolling thunder. Many could not even sleep properly anymore. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear followed them constantly. One French soldier later wrote that the war felt less like a campaign and more like being abandoned at the edge of the world. Yet commanders kept demanding more. More attacks, more marches, more endurance from men already nearing collapse. The siege of Sevastopol slowly transformed into the center of this nightmare. What many leaders believed would be a short operation stretched into month after month of attrition. Trenches spread across the hillsides in every direction. Soldiers spent endless hours digging through frozen dirt, hauling ammunition, repairing fortifications, and waiting for bombardments that could begin without warning. Thick smoke drifted over the battlefield almost constantly. Entire sections of ground became impossible to recognize beneath shattered earth and abandoned equipment. Even experienced officers struggled to understand how warfare had changed so quickly. The battlefield no longer rewarded bold uniforms and dramatic charges the way military tradition promised. Instead, survival depended on engineering, supply chains, communication, and industrial production. But Europe had not prepared for that reality yet. The men trapped in Crimea paid the price for that failure every single day. Disease spread through camps faster than military doctors could respond. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, and respiratory illness moved silently through overcrowded tents, packed with exhausted soldiers weakened by poor food and constant exposure to the cold. Field hospitals overflowed almost immediately. Supplies vanished faster than they arrived. Some wounded men waited days before receiving treatment. Others never even reached medical stations at all because roads had become nearly impassable beneath winter conditions. Back home, civilians reading newspaper reports struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. This was not the clean imperial adventure they had been promised. Correspondents described freezing soldiers wrapped in torn blankets, exhausted horses collapsing beside supply carts, and entire camps overwhelmed by sickness and confusion. For the first time, the modern public began witnessing the machinery of war breaking down in real time. And somewhere beneath all of it, another terrifying truth was beginning to emerge. The world was entering an era where technology could destroy human beings faster than governments, armies, or medicine could save them. By the winter of 1854, Crimea no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a trap slowly closing around everyone inside it. The soldiers could sense it first. The sea behind them had become unpredictable, supply routes were collapsing, and ahead lay the massive defenses of Sevastopol, where Russian forces refused to break despite months of pressure. Every day the war consumed more men, more equipment, and more hope. And still, no one could see an end to it. The camps spreading across the hills outside the city looked less like organized military positions and more like desperate settlements clinging to survival. Mud covered nearly everything. Wagons sank into the earth until horses could barely move them. Boots rotted from constant moisture. Blankets stayed damp for days at a time. Fires struggled against freezing winds rolling inland from the Black Sea. Soldiers woke in the morning with frost covering their uniforms and ice forming along the edges of their tents. Some men stopped removing their boots entirely because they feared they would never get them back on once their feet swelled from cold and exhaustion. The deeper winter settled in, the more the campaign began to unravel. At Balaclava Harbor, mountains of supplies sat untouched near the docks, while soldiers at the front lacked basic necessities. Crates of winter clothing, medicine, food, and fuel waited only a few miles away, but broken transportation systems turned that short distance into an impossible journey. Roads had become rivers of mud. Animals collapsed from overwork and starvation. Supply drivers disappeared in storms or simply abandoned their wagons after days without proper food or sleep. One British officer later admitted that the army was being defeated as much by logistics as by the Russians themselves. And while the supply system failed, the siege itself grew more brutal with every passing week. Sevastopol was not collapsing the way commanders expected. Russian defenses held stubbornly against bombardment after bombardment. Trenches spread across the landscape in tangled lines of dirt and timber, forcing soldiers on both sides into a constant cycle of digging, waiting, repairing, and enduring. At night, cannon fire echoed across the hills, while lanterns flickered through fog and smoke drifting over the camps. Men slept lightly, if they slept at all. Every distant explosion reminded them that the next bombardment could begin before dawn. The psychological strain became impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had marched into Crimea believing in glory and patriotism now spoke mostly about warmth, food, dry socks, and surviving another week. Letters home changed tone completely. Early optimism vanished beneath exhaustion and bitterness. Some men wrote about the silence that followed artillery barrages, when freezing wind moved through shattered earth while exhausted soldiers stared into the darkness, wondering how much longer any human being could continue living this way. Others admitted they no longer understood why the war had even started. Yet perhaps the cruelest part was this: the suffering was no longer hidden from the outside world. Newspaper correspondents continued sending reports back to Europe describing overcrowded hospitals, starving horses, exhausted troops, and commanders struggling to maintain control over a campaign spiraling deeper into disaster. Civilians back home began realizing that this was not the glorious imperial conflict they had imagined. It was something colder and far more frightening. Crimea had become the first modern war zone where an entire society could watch the collapse unfold almost in real time. And somewhere inside those frozen camps outside Sevastopol, the old image of noble warfare was slowly dying in the mud. Then came the moment that shattered whatever illusions still remained. Not just for the soldiers trapped in Crimea, but for the entire world watching from afar. Because by the autumn of 1854, the war had begun producing scenes so chaotic and senseless that even experienced officers struggled to explain them afterward. The most famous of these moments unfolded near the small port of Balaclava, where confusion, pride, outdated command structures, and modern firepower collided in a way that would haunt military history forever. The battlefield itself was covered in smoke and dust as Russian and Allied forces maneuvered across narrow valleys surrounded by hills lined with artillery. Orders moved slowly through chains of command, already strained by distance, noise, and poor communication. Messages passed from one officer to another changed meaning as they traveled. Some commanders interpreted instructions differently from others. And in the middle of that confusion stood cavalry units trained for a style of warfare that was already becoming obsolete. For generations, cavalry charges had represented the height of battlefield prestige. Fast-moving horsemen could break formations, pursue retreating enemies, and dominate older battlefields through speed and shock. But Crimea was not an older battlefield anymore. Rifled muskets and modern artillery had changed everything. Yet many commanders still believed courage and discipline alone could overcome technology. That belief carried hundreds of riders directly into disaster. As cavalry forces advanced down the valley, artillery fire erupted from multiple directions. Smoke rolled across the hillsides, while horses struggled through uneven ground under deafening cannon blasts. Officers attempted to maintain formation as confusion spread through the ranks. Some soldiers later described the feeling as surreal, almost dreamlike, with noise so overwhelming it became difficult to think clearly at all. What made the moment truly terrifying was not simply the danger itself, but the realization that the attack never should have happened the way it did. The battlefield had become too deadly, too complex, and too modern for the old assumptions still guiding Europe's armies. And yet, commanders continued issuing orders shaped by traditions from another era entirely. News of the charge spread rapidly across Europe. Newspapers transformed the event into legend almost immediately, praising bravery and sacrifice. Poems were written, paintings celebrated the courage of the riders. But beneath the romantic language lingered a darker truth few wanted to confront openly. The charge was not proof that old warfare still worked. It was proof that the old system was failing catastrophically. The same pattern repeated throughout the campaign. Infantry assaults stalled beneath devastating rifle fire. Artillery bombardments lasted for hours, only to produce minimal gains. Trenches expanded across the hills around Sevastopol as both sides dug deeper into defensive positions that increasingly resembled the battlefields of the next century rather than the previous one. Soldiers no longer advanced through open fields with confidence and banners waving proudly overhead. They crouched behind earthworks, waded through bombardments, and measured survival one exhausting day at a time. Many officers refused to admit how dramatically warfare had changed. But ordinary soldiers understood it instinctively. They could feel it every time artillery shook the ground beneath them. They saw it in the endless trench lines cutting across the frozen hills. They heard it in the terrified horses screaming during bombardments, and in the exhausted silence afterward when smoke drifted over shattered terrain. Crimea was becoming a warning, a glimpse of the industrialized slaughter waiting in the future. But Europe still was not ready to understand what it was seeing. As the siege dragged deeper into 1855, the battlefield outside Sevastopol began consuming entire armies in ways Europe had never fully experienced before. The cannon fire still mattered. The trenches still stretched across the hills like open scars in the earth. But increasingly, soldiers discovered that the greatest danger did not always arrive with an enemy attack. Sometimes it arrived silently through freezing rain, contaminated water, infected wounds, or simple exhaustion that the human body could no longer endure. The camps had become places of slow collapse. Everywhere men looked, they saw signs that the system itself was failing. Horses lay frozen beside abandoned wagons. Supply depots ran low on essentials despite ships still arriving at the ports. Tents sagged beneath constant storms, while muddy pathways between camps turned into rivers of filth impossible to cross without sinking ankle-deep into the ground. The smell of wet wool, smoke, sickness, and unwashed bodies hung permanently in the cold air. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, stiffened by moisture, and slept beside fires that barely stayed lit against the winds sweeping in from the Black Sea. Many stopped speaking about victory entirely. They spoke only about surviving another day. The hospitals were even worse. What civilians back home imagined as places of recovery often looked more like overcrowded warehouses, struggling to contain human suffering on a scale doctors could barely manage. Medical knowledge remained painfully limited by modern standards. Infections spread rapidly through cramped conditions. Supplies vanished almost immediately. Surgeons worked for endless hours under weak lantern light, while exhausted nurses tried desperately to keep pace with the flow of wounded and sick arriving from the trenches. One British observer later admitted that entering some hospitals felt more terrifying than standing near the front lines. Men who had survived artillery bombardments sometimes weakened beyond recovery after days of fever, exposure, or untreated illness. And all of this unfolded while Europe watched through newspaper reports arriving week after week. Correspondents described scenes that shocked the public back home. They wrote about soldiers lacking proper boots during winter storms, overcrowded medical stations, and exhausted troops waiting endlessly for supplies trapped only a few miles away. The reports triggered outrage in Britain especially, where citizens began questioning how one of the most powerful empires in the world could send armies across the sea, yet fail to provide basic care for the men fighting there. The war was exposing something deeper than military mistakes. It was exposing the limits of 19th century society itself. Governments had mastered industrial production well enough to build larger armies, deadlier weapons, and faster transportation. But they had not yet learned how to care for the human beings trapped inside those massive systems. Technology had accelerated warfare faster than medicine, logistics, and leadership could adapt. And nowhere was that imbalance clearer than in Crimea. Even the soldiers could feel it happening around them. Veterans who survived the long months outside Sevastopol often described a strange, emotional numbness settling over the camps. Time blurred together beneath endless bombardments, freezing nights, and exhausting labor. Men stopped measuring the war by battles and started measuring it by weather, food deliveries, and rumors of reinforcements that rarely arrived on schedule. Some no longer feared death in the dramatic way civilians imagined. Instead, they feared sickness, isolation, and the slow erosion of both body and mind that came from existing too long in conditions no human being was meant to endure. Crimea was no longer simply a war between empires. It had become a machine, grinding down everyone trapped inside it. And the terrifying part was that this machine was only the beginning of what modern warfare would eventually become. For the soldiers trapped around Sevastopol, the war slowly stopped feeling like history and started feeling like an endless season of suffering with no clear beginning or end. Days blurred together beneath smoke, freezing wind, and exhaustion so deep that many men struggled to remember what normal life had once felt like. The grand speeches about empire and national honor had faded long ago. Down in the trenches and camps, survival became painfully simple. Find dry socks if possible. Protect your rifle from mud. Keep warm through the night. Hope the next shipment of food actually arrives. Hope the coughing in the next tent does not spread. Hope the bombardment stays farther down the line tonight. The emotional strain wore soldiers down in ways few civilians could fully understand. Some men had not slept properly in weeks. Cannon fire echoed constantly across the hills, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, but never truly absent. Even during moments of silence, many soldiers remained tense, waiting for the next explosion or sudden alarm. One French infantryman later admitted that the silence itself became frightening because it usually meant something bad was coming. Men learned to sleep lightly with boots still on, rifles within reach, and blankets wrapped tightly around bodies weakened by cold and hunger. The conditions changed people slowly. Letters sent home revealed how dramatically morale had shifted over time. Early in the campaign, soldiers described excitement, patriotism, and confidence. Months later, those same men wrote mostly about weather, illness, and exhaustion. Some apologized to their families for sounding hopeless. Others stopped describing the battlefield entirely because they no longer believed words could explain what life in Crimea actually felt like. One British soldier wrote that he no longer measured time by days or weeks, but by how many friends had disappeared from his tent line since the last snowfall. Yet even inside this misery, moments of humanity still survived. Soldiers shared food whenever possible. Men wrapped spare cloth around a freezing comrade's hands. Exhausted nurses moved through overcrowded hospitals for hours at a time, trying to comfort strangers far from home. Officers sometimes abandoned formal military behavior completely, sitting beside ordinary soldiers near weak fires while storms shook the camps outside. The war stripped away much of the distance between ranks because suffering touched everyone eventually. No uniform protected a man from cold, disease, or exhaustion. Some of the most haunting moments came not during battle, but afterward. Soldiers described walking through camps at night while lanterns flickered dimly through fog drifting over the hills. Rows of exhausted men sat silently beside fires, staring into the darkness, too tired even to speak. Horses shifted weakly in the mud beside supply wagons that had not moved in days. Far in the distance, artillery flashes illuminated the horizon for a few seconds before fading again into blackness. It no longer resembled the heroic image of war celebrated in paintings back home. It felt industrial, mechanical, and deeply lonely. And perhaps that was the most important transformation happening in Crimea. The war was changing how human beings experienced combat itself. Previous generations often imagined battle as moments of sudden violence, separated by long periods of movement and recovery. But this campaign introduced something different: continuous psychological pressure, endless exposure to fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The trenches around Sevastopol became places where men slowly unraveled under conditions that never truly stopped. By the time many soldiers finally left Crimea, they carried something invisible back home with them. Not just memories of battle, but the realization that modern warfare could consume the human mind long before it consumed the body. And Europe still had not yet seen the worst of what that future would bring. By late 1855, the siege lines around Sevastopol no longer resembled the confident imperial campaign Europe had imagined at the beginning of the war. The battlefield had become a monument to exhaustion. Trenches stretched endlessly across ruined hillsides scarred by months of artillery fire. Entire sections of earth had been reshaped by bombardments so constant that soldiers sometimes struggled to recognize positions they had occupied only weeks earlier. Smoke drifted through the camps almost continuously, mixing with cold sea air and the smell of damp soil, burned timber, and overcrowded encampments pushed far beyond their limits. The war was grinding everyone down now. Not just the soldiers in the trenches, but the governments, commanders, and systems trying desperately to sustain the conflict from thousands of miles away. The old image of military perfection had collapsed completely. European armies had entered Crimea believing discipline and tradition could solve nearly every battlefield problem. Instead, the campaign exposed how fragile those institutions really were once modern technology and industrial warfare began placing pressure on them. Supply systems broke under the weight of prolonged siege operations. Communication failures repeatedly turned confusion into catastrophe. Medical services could not keep pace with the scale of suffering unfolding around Sevastopol. Even experienced officers often admitted privately that events had slipped beyond anyone's full control. The war no longer moved according to elegant strategies drawn on maps and distant headquarters. It moved according to weather, logistics, exhaustion, and industrial firepower. The psychological collapse was becoming impossible to hide. Soldiers who had survived nearly a year in Crimea often appeared decades older than when they first arrived. Faces became gaunt beneath heavy beards and worn uniforms. Eyes carried the hollow exhaustion of men who had spent too long living beside constant fear and deprivation. Some soldiers barely reacted to artillery anymore. Others jumped at every sudden sound, even far behind the front lines. Many had simply adapted to a world where danger never fully disappeared, where sleep came in short, restless intervals beneath freezing rain and distant cannon fire. One officer described the camps as places where men slowly forgot how ordinary life was supposed to feel. Yet perhaps the greatest collapse was ideological. Crimea destroyed the comforting illusion that war could remain civilized while technology continued evolving at industrial speed. Politicians and generals still spoke publicly about honor, duty, and controlled military operations. But the reality unfolding on the peninsula told a different story entirely. Modern rifles turned open-field assaults into disasters. Artillery shattered traditional battlefield formations. Trenches expanded into vast defensive systems where armies bled strength slowly rather than winning quick, decisive victories. Industrial transportation allowed governments to sustain larger wars than ever before, while industrial weapons ensured those wars became increasingly destructive once they began. Europe had entered a new age of warfare without understanding what that truly meant, and the public could see it happening. Newspapers continued publishing reports and sketches from the front, bringing images of exhausted soldiers and shattered battlefields directly into homes across Britain and France. Civilians watched arguments erupt over failed leadership, broken supply systems, and horrifying conditions in military hospitals. Confidence in governments weakened. Faith in military leadership weakened. Even the romantic image of war itself began eroding beneath the growing weight of reality. Crimea was exposing truths that Europe would spend decades trying to ignore. The terrifying power of industrialized conflict. The inability of old institutions to adapt quickly enough. The psychological toll of prolonged modern warfare. The brutal reality that technology was changing faster than human wisdom, and although the guns around Sevastopol would eventually fall silent, the deeper consequences of what happened there would not disappear with the peace. They would linger beneath Europe's surface for generations, waiting for an even larger catastrophe to awaken them again. When the guns finally began to fall silent in 1856, Europe tried to move on as quickly as possible. Politicians spoke about treaties, diplomacy, and restored balance between empires. Newspapers slowly shifted their attention elsewhere. Survivors boarded ships home carrying worn uniforms, lingering illnesses, and memories they would struggle to explain for the rest of their lives. On the surface, the war appeared finished, but beneath that surface, something far more dangerous had already been set into motion. Because the true legacy of Crimea was not territorial change or political victory. It was the terrifying glimpse it gave humanity into the future of industrial warfare. Almost every nightmare that would later define the 20th century had already appeared there in its earliest form. Endless trench systems cutting across shattered landscapes. Artillery dominating entire battlefields for months at a time. Governments struggling to manage mass armies supplied through industrial networks. Journalists bringing the horror of the front directly into civilian homes. Soldiers collapsing not only from combat, but from exhaustion, exposure, and psychological strain that never truly ended. The world often remembers the First World War as the moment modern warfare was born. But the shadows of that future had already emerged on the frozen hills outside Sevastopol decades earlier. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how little Europe truly learned from the warning. Military thinkers studied Crimea closely after the war ended. Reports were written, reforms were discussed. Some improvements in medicine, logistics, and communications followed in the years ahead. Florence Nightingale's work transformed modern nursing. Armies slowly modernized portions of their supply systems. Governments recognized that public opinion could now shape warfare in entirely new ways because of mass media. Yet despite all of this, the deeper lesson remained largely ignored. Technology was advancing faster than human institutions could control it. Weapons had entered the industrial age. Human wisdom had not. Within less than 60 years, Europe would once again send millions of young men into trenches stretching across entire continents. Once again, artillery would dominate the battlefield. Once again, soldiers would sit in mud beneath endless bombardments while governments promised victory just over the horizon. Once again, entire societies would discover that modern war could consume human beings on a scale older generations could barely imagine. The road to that future did not begin in 1914. In many ways, it began in Crimea. And that is why this war still feels strangely unsettling even now. Because when you strip away the paintings, the patriotic speeches, and the simplified textbook versions of events, what remains is not just an old 19th century conflict. What remains is humanity standing at the edge of a new age without fully understanding what it had created. The soldiers freezing outside Sevastopol did not know they were witnessing the first outlines of the modern battlefield. The officers issuing outdated orders did not realize history was already moving past them. The civilians reading newspaper reports over breakfast could not yet imagine how much worse industrial war would eventually become. But the warning signs were all there, buried beneath the mud, smoke, and freezing winds of Crimea. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. The future often announces itself quietly, long before the world is willing to recognize it. Somewhere on those dark hills overlooking the Black Sea, beneath collapsing trenches and drifting winter fog, modern warfare introduced itself to humanity for the first time. And even now, more than a century later, the question still lingers like distant artillery rolling through the night. If the world failed to fully understand the warning Crimea gave it then, how many warnings are we still failing to understand today?